Welcome to the new series I've been working on, and I've titled it Searching for the Ideal Government. And the goal of this series is to look at government through a biblical lens and to see what the Bible has to say through all sorts of different types of forms of government and political ideologies. And that's what we're hopefully going to achieve. Now, first, we got to talk a little bit about government. So government, love them or hate them, they have been around since the beginning of the world. Depending on your definition, that is, if you look up the definition, you will find various definitions that all relatively state the same thing. That government is the action or manners, or you could say systems, or of controlling or regulating a nation, organization, or people. So you could say the Garden of Eden, there was a government, since there was regulations implemented on a group of people. Now, this is to say that there was one law that these people had to abide by, and two people at that time that the law was enforced on. This was the smallest government we'll have and will ever be. Modern day governments have taken on new roles and responsibilities and whole structural differences from what the original government was. So this series, I want to look at all the things relating to government and to see if some forms and roles that different governments have are biblical, of course. And so it's just some of them, I want to hopefully get to is, socialism, free trade, democracies, republics, monarchs, how big government should be, all sorts of things I'd like to get to eventually. But so yes, we'll go in more in depth eventually, hopefully also on what exactly the role of government is instead of just kind of the broad definition of government. But I thought the first lesson really, and that is what we're going to get to, is should we even have a government? And so that's before we even really exactly get to the purpose of government. It is at least more in depth. We must determine should we even have one to begin with, or is anarchy, as you see the symbol in the lower right hand side, there's the A inside the circle, and the A stands for anarchy, and O is without ruler. Now, this is an interesting topic because actually there are, as on my research, those who consider themselves Christian anarchists, and that was really interesting to find. And so they had to go really in depth of what anarchy is. And so anarchy, there are two views as I could find. The term anarchy can mean many things to different people, though. Since there's not one concise philosophical approach, some use it as the revolt or rebellion from the government, or kind of anti-government. But that implies one first has to have a government to rebel from. Now, while others see it as a utopian society free from any government, the first perspective of anarchy is a rebellion from government and any other form of authority. This form of anarchy could go from government to government trying to overthrow them, or at least make a ruckus until the police took them to jail. There are many verses that simply refute the idea of rebellions or revolutions, such as Romans 13:1, let every person be subject to the governing authorities. This verse is clearly stating that we, as Christians, should be submissive to our government. This includes governments we do not quite like. Just think about what government was in power at the time of the writing of this verse. That's Rome, the government who crucified our Lord and Savior, using, as many today would say, as barbaric and inhumane punishment. Yet, we are still called to submit. And this does not make us any less human if we have to submit to a government that is oppressive in a certain nature. There are other verses that talk about having rebellious nature in of itself is wrong, such as Proverbs 17:11. It says, a rebellious man seeks only evil. Therefore, a cruel messenger will be sent against him. Simply put, a rebellious person is not searching for what is good, but is evil. Having a rebellious spirit is not one of the fruits of the Spirit that Christ is desiring us to develop. With this first perspective of being anti-government as rebellion against authority is simply not Christian, and interestingly enough, illegal as well. It's actually illegal for anyone to advocate for the government overthrow of our government. And I originally thought this would just fall under free speech, but this makes sense for this stability of our government. If our government promoted overthrows of itself, I'm sure we would have government takeovers every time a big enough group of people did not like the president elected, which incidentally is just about every time, since half of America is not happy with the results with a two-party system. So anarchy, a promotion of anarchy, leads to civil unrest. And so definitely this is not something God would want, with unity, obviously. And so with the first philosophical approach to anarchy being a rebellion of government, it doesn't make any sense. Now, looking at the other perspective, the utopian perspective deeper, the utopian society and what stands to believe, the philosophy, you could say, is more a purist form, which believes that all submission to the state, power, or any authority is slavery at its core, and any that submit lose their individual autonomy and are humiliated by submitting to any authority. Their slogan that I found was neither God nor master, since they are inherently against any form of hierarchy. Anarchy is inherently against religion because they are all hierarchical in nature. Having a God or a supreme being where you have the individual, or you as the individual, must struggle through life trying to follow the rules set by God. And so as I said previously, that there are certain Christians that consider themselves Christian anarchists, but from the purest philosophical beliefs that I could find for anarchy, it seems to be inherently against religion, all religions. It just doesn't make any sense. But freedom is their core identity, stating that no one can make a better decision than you about your life. Therefore, everyone should be their own master. Of course, freedom is not wrong, and we will talk more in depth in other topics, but to argue any infringement being any law is inherently wrong is short-sighted. There are few things anarchists get wrong philosophically, though this is due partly, as I would say, because they are not looking through the lens of through Christianity, or you could say a religious view. 1 Corinthians 10:23-24 says, all things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me, but not all things edify. Let no one seek his own, but each one the other's well-being. So this chapter is often preached about Christian liberty and freedom as it relates to meat offered to idols. The conclusion was the meat in and of itself is not sinful, since there are no other gods beside the true God. But the ability to cause others to stumble should be taken seriously. Paul makes the argument that it is best to consider your neighbor and relinquish some of your freedoms that you might have in order to protect your neighbor. The anarchist solely focuses on individualism and freedom that they do not consider their neighbor, making this ideology inherently selfish. Now, other problems that the anarchists have is perspective that government and authority and laws are the enemy. With Romans 7:7 it says, what shall we say then? Is the law sin? May it never be. On the contrary, I would not have come to know sin except through the law. To the notion that laws are oppressive, Paul states that laws are for the purpose of understanding right and wrong as something we can learn from, and that keeps us safe. Of course, you can argue that not all laws are moral, but neutral, or potentially even wrong in some governments. But government needs to declare what they consider right and wrong using laws to protect the people from other evil people. Or else there would be no standard to what morality is, and we would be under the philosophy of relativism. Now in John 8:34 says, Jesus replied, very truly I say to you, everyone who sins is a slave to sin. I would say the real culprit to oppression is sin, instead of laws and a master. That is not the real culprit. There's another verse in Jeremiah 17:9 says, the heart is deceitful above all things. And so I would say also the real culprit to the true oppressor is our own sin nature, and we are a slave to it. We are no slave to government or laws, but to our own nature. Many times we can't even see our own flaws and need an outside perspective. The only thing that can set us free from our sin is Jesus Christ. So oppression is seen through this verse. Now, another verse you could look at is 1 Timothy 1:9. And some might argue this, that knowing this, that the law is not made for righteous man, one could state that I'm a good person. I don't need to be told what I can and cannot do. And on one hand, assuming you are a righteous person, that may be the case. You will do what is right, regardless someone telling you what to do. But the thing is, the verse continues. It says, but for the lawless and the disobedient, for the ungodly and for sinners, for unholy and profane, for murderers of fathers and murderers of mothers, for murderers. This is where, in a perfect world, sure, you don't need a government. But we live in a very corrupt society, and therefore require some form of government to keep people in line and to keep society at peace. There's a quote I stumbled upon by Theodore Roosevelt. Men can never escape being governed. Either they must govern themselves, or they must submit to being governed by others. There will always be people who need to be told what to do. We see then that some freedoms are given up for the protection of others. Laws instituted by government are not inherently evil, since they are there for the lawbreakers. Laws are merely boundaries that keep us safe and ensure human interactions are fair and honest. And finally, that the true oppressor is the individual itself, not the government. Of course, you might be thinking about, what if the government is evil? But I will say we'll get to that on another lesson. So, anarchy with the utopian. The whole idea of anarchy sounds nice. Absolute freedom. No laws to keep you oppressed. This idea stems from our inherent desire to be our own gods and masters. But the joke about anarchy is it never lasts more than a day. It would require the entire world to be on board with this idea. Or else the nations that have power could easily walk in and take over, since the anarchists are also against having a military, since it's hierarchical in nature. Another major flaw with anarchy is the lack of structure and the inability to handle contracts and evil people, really. Let's say I break a contract with someone. Who are they going to complain to? There are no authorities I have to listen to. Nothing is illegal since there are no government to enforce laws. If I want to rob a bank or kill someone, again, I'm also fine. There are no cops, no jails to lock me up. At this point, the only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. And so you would end up with the wild, wild west society with posters of wanted people being hunted down for various deeds and bounties. This society would end up being survival of the fittest, or as some have said, might makes right. So if you're the strongest, then you kind of set the rules. Now, to live at peace with others, it requires rules that we can all agree upon. And when things go wrong, we need a third-party entity to step in that has authority that we can rely on to solve disputes and protect people from harm. Power and authority needs to be understood as neutral and amoral. Power and authority is only wrong when abused. We cannot simply throw out the whole concept, since there are evil people in the world. Now, government will ultimately be formed. It may not be instantly, but it will grow naturally. Individuals come together to form families. Families form tribes. Tribes form cities. Cities form nations. Nations in turn form international alliances. That is the natural order of things. The anarchist fails to recognize that the government such as our own is for the people, by the people. We are ruled by our peers that are elected, not someone who usurped power and are ruling tyranny on the people. Just think, even without being forced, many live in housing communities that have rules and regulations such as what color you're allowed to paint your house, whether or not you can get rid of your grass for rocks, and even an HOA fee that essentially is a tax. Now sure, you end up getting benefits like local playgrounds, but this is to show that people willingly organize and set up rules and authorities for themselves. With this in mind, you can see that with different people, different governments might naturally develop. The more moral the people, more freedom can be given, since they won't do anything wrong to begin with, or at least less. Now, with immoral people, a stronger rule of law will need to be enforced, and they won't do on their own. And so that is the conclusion of Anarchy. It does not seem to be biblical in any shape or the form, but it will crumble and eventually become a government. Thank you, and see you next time on kind of my government series.